Second scripture is from Matthew 4, verses 1 through 17. Jesus' temptation. Then the Spirit led Jesus up into the wilderness so that the devil might tempt him. After Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was starving. You are God's son, command these stones to become bread. Jesus replied, it's written, people won't live only by bread, but by every word spoken by God. After that, the devil brought him into the holy city and stood him at the highest point of the temple. He said to him, since you are God's son, throw yourself down, for it is written, I will command my angels concerning you, and they will take you up in their hands so that you won't get your foot on a stone. Jesus replied, again, it's written, don't test the Lord your God. Then the devil brought him and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He said, I'll give you these if you bow down and worship me. Jesus responded, go away, Satan, because it's written, you will worship the Lord your God and serve only him. The devil left him, came and took care of him. Now when he was arrested, he went to Galilee. He left Nazareth and settled in Capernaum, which lies alongside the sea in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. This fulfilled what Isaiah the prophet said. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, alongside the sea, Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who have lived in the dark have seen a great light, and a light has come upon those who live in the region and in the shadow of death. From that time, Jesus began to announce, change your hearts and lives.
Morning. So I have a couple of friends. Their names are Melanie and Melissa. And I haven't seen them in quite a long time, but we remain Facebook friends, so I get to peek into their lives online. But I lived with them and another young woman for a short time, about 29 years ago. We all went to church together, and the four of us moved into a 2-bedroom apartment when I was 19 and when I turned 21. As sisters go, Melanie and Melissa got along pretty well, but they could also get into arguments. But often, if things got heated a bit, they would kind of diffuse things by having what I call a proverbial match of wits, spewing proverbs back and forth, trying to one up the other using proverbs from the Bible. It was pretty fun to watch. When it's something like this, so they'd be arguing and, oh yeah, well, the way of the wicked, like deep darkness, they don't know what makes them stumble. Don't be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and shun evil. Give careful thought to the paths of your deeds, and be steadfast in all your ways. The lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech, in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Do not lust in your heart after her beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them, the cords of their sins hold them fast. At the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. Anyway, this would go on and on until they couldn't come up with any more good proverb digs at each other. And I would just watch them fascinated, wishing I had a sister to do that with. Anyway, as I read this familiar Matthew passage again with the devil and Jesus basically spouting scripture at each other as they argued in the wilderness. My girlfriend's quoting Proverbs at each other came to my mind. It's interesting to me that the devil in the story has the gall to try to tempt or manipulate Jesus by quoting scripture. Did the devil not know that Jesus was just as much fully God as he was fully human? In actuality, it's unlikely this event actually the author of Matthew, or authors of Matthew, as is believed to be the case, are using this story to show the readers that Jesus is not like humans. At this time in history, the Hebrew people would have all heard about the stories of their ancestors wandering in the wilderness for 40 years after leaving Egypt. They would have heard how they had grumbled and complained and built golden idols to worship, hoping for some God, any God, to get them out of that. And so here's a story of Jesus being led by the Spirit to the wilderness in order to be tested or tempted, just to show Matthew's readers that Jesus was not like the average human. Jesus did not give in to temptation. Jesus remained faithful to God's ways, whereas the Hebrew people had not always done so. This story of the Jesus follows right after Jesus' baptism in Matthew's gospel. Announces to all who are nearby, "This is my son, whom I dearly love." So this comes at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is the ultimate validation to God's ways. And Jesus is fully qualified to be a rabbi who can lead disciples to a new way of living. If anyone doubted anything that John the Baptist had about Jesus, well, one who is above all others, one who cannot be led astray even by the devil. And Jesus begins his ministry as written in verse 17. From that time, Jesus began to announce, "Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven." We see those words "from that time" once more in Matthew 16, verse 21, where it says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples to go and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." It's quite a sentence. Instances here, that time signals a major story. This one marks the beginning of his ministry. The next one marks the beginning of the end of his life. So that's maybe what this passage meant to the original readers. Jesus in humanity experienced similar temptations as we humans encounter in order to provide a scriptural example for us to imitate in our own actions and responses to temptations. And so as I read it again this week, I got to thinking about the wildernesses we find ourselves in. Those times of isolation or desperation. We react in those times. Do we act more like the Israelites and look for some form of God, like Jesus? I imagine if I were in Jesus' shoes in that day, after 3 days, I would have turned that that some I struggle toward things that I think I need. God has something ever receive spirit the amazing wilderness are the same. Wilderness experience of transformation resulting from the quiet and solitude of the wilderness, where there's room for God to speak, and where we are often desperate to hear God speak. Fortunately, our current society offers a way of living that can stifle the gains of a wilderness experience. These days, it's easy to surround oneself with a constant barrage of noise in the form of entertainment, social media, news, utterly preventing the kind of quiet recollection necessary to hearing God sometimes, as happens in an isolated wilderness experience. Imagine if Jesus was in that desert for 40 days and nights with his smartphone full of apps and games to keep him entertained. What a different experience that would have been. It's essential that we be aware of the challenges of our society and the ways that we cleverly avoid the wilderness so that we don't miss out on a great opportunity for growth. As much as we might prefer to avoid it, the wilderness is where God is found. The wilderness is where God does some of God's best work in us. Sometimes God takes us to the wilderness not only to show us God's self, but to show us ourselves. The truth about who we are and how we trust God surfaces in the wilderness. If you dig into the biblical wilderness stories, if you sift through the dry desert sands, you might find something stirring under the surface. As a hapless bunch of Hebrew slaves wander lost in the desert, God meets them there in a fiery mountain and forms them into a nation. As Jesus struggles with hunger, thirst, and temptation to use his power, he resists. And angels come to him, he gains the strength to go out and save the world. It's no question that Jesus straight into proclaiming when we follow God through the desert, we can't help but have our hearts and lives changed. The desert and wilderness stories in the Bible are not disconnected. They form an arc of hope and promise. The stories teach us that life has wilderness periods, and sometimes they last a very long time. But that it's